So this video is about biological classification by reproductive methods. The syllabus objective says that you need to be able to recognise that biological classification can be based on different levels of similarity of methods of reproduction. So we're going to look at asexual versus sexual reproduction, but then also compare K and R selection. One of the fundamental things in biology is the whole purpose of So to understand strategies of reproduction, we need to remember the key principles of biology. The first one is that the job of any organism is to survive and reproduce so that the species can continue. And the other fundamental point is about species occupy a niche. That is its specialized function and role within an ecosystem. And for it to be able to survive in this niche, it needs to have strategies. And one of the ways in which it can exploit its niche is through the way that it reproduces. So this video is all about strategies that species use to be able to reproduce. So let's firstly look at asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction doesn't require a partner, doesn't require specialized gametes or sex cells. The benefit of asexual reproduction is that it's rapid. It doesn't require a mate, so it doesn't require so because it doesn't require a mate, we can have a rapid population increase. It's ideal when colonizing a new environment, when there's a niche that's opened up, and then a species is able to exploit that gap and to be able to increase its population really quickly. The downside of it, though, is that there's no genetic variation, so the offspring are exactly the same as the parent. There's a number of different strategies that species can use for asexual reproduction. I've got some of them down here, and that's not even all of them. So budding is when a small version of the organism breaks off and lands on the substrate and grows. You might see this in things like Hydra, which is kind of like a Cnidaria. Binary fission we see with bacteria, so one becomes two. Fragmentation, like with a starfish here, a part that gets broken off, it grows into a new organism. And vegetative propagation, this is like your many plant species like bananas and a lot of the grasses and things. So you have these underground roots called rhizomes that spread out, and then new shoots can grow from there. This isn't all of them, but there are opportunities for species to be able to reproduce asexually and increase their population really quickly. Now, with sexual reproduction, it actually requires two parents. It requires genetic material from two parents. It normally requires specialized gametes or sex cells. And the benefit of it is that every time we have a union of genetic material from both parents, it's a shuffling of the genetic cards so that we have variation, and that variation is really important for evolutionary success. Just like asexual reproduction, there's loads of different types of sexual reproduction, and they basically vary based on where fertilization occurs and where development of the offspring occurs. So there can be internal fertilization, for example, in mammals, where the sperm and the egg unite within the fallopian tube or within the uterus, or it can be external, like say, for example, with fish, the female fish spawn eggs, and the male fish release sperm into the water, and they float around and they meet, and we get fertilization external. And then also in terms of development, whether the offspring develops internally, like a mammal, or externally, like for example with a bird or a reptile, it develops in a shell. So these are all different strategies in which species are able to achieve reproduction. And there's so much variety because species occupy different niches, and they need to exploit those niches to be able to reproduce. So another way we can look at this is by comparing K and R strategists. And a good way to look at that is by looking at how their population growth curves vary. Now, there's another way that we can classify species based on their reproduction strategies, and that is by considering K and R strategists. Now these are two ends of the spectrum. I'm going to talk to you about them separately, but then understand that of course there's always variation, and it's a range, so there's variation in between. So a nice way to compare K and R strategists is by looking at their population growth curves. Let's start by looking at the R strategists. Please note that it's a lowercase r, which means reproduction rate. R strategists are species that have a high reproduction rate. I want you to think about, well, the way I remember R is for rodents or rats. So generally small species that reproduce really quickly, have a large number of offspring. Many of those offspring don't actually survive to adulthood. They reach sexual maturity very quickly. And so you see a really rapid increase in their population. So they're opportunistic. Whenever the conditions are right, when there's low competition, when there's plenty of food, perfect conditions, they're able to reproduce really, really rapidly and produce a very large population very, very quickly. You know, it's ideal for colonizing new environments or exploiting niches that have been opened up. For example, there might have been a landslide or something. The first species you see growing or colonizing in that bare dirt is your weed species, for example. You know, often in summertime in outback Australia, when the conditions are perfect, we get a mouse or a rat plague that just comes out of nowhere. And so, you know, there's periods of time when you don't see any mice or rats at all, and then suddenly there's a plague and the population rises very quickly, and then we have a boom, and then we have a bust, and the population decreases again. This is what we see with R strategists, and R means reproduction rate. So the R strategists have a high reproduction rate. It's a strategy for survival. It's a strategy that exploits a particular niche. These are the populations that produce really quickly when there's low competition, and really exploit and make the most of those conditions while they last. And let's compare that to K strategists. K means carrying capacity. K strategists, thinking of humans, you know, large mammals like elephants, and also large trees and things. These are species that have very few offspring. They have a long childhood, slow to reach maturity, and there's a large amount of parenting. Why is carrying capacity important? Well, because what carrying capacity is basically it's the maximum population of a species that can be maintained by an ecosystem. So when the population gets up around this carrying capacity, it does oscillate around that, but it's a fairly stable environment where there's lots of competition for resources. So for that reason, K strategists have far less offspring, and they invest so much parenting to ensure that those offspring achieve adulthood and sexual maturity. So K strategists are at the other end of the spectrum when there's a lot of competition for resources, where there's large but stable populations. And these are organisms like, or species like elephants and the great apes and humans, the large trees and things. The difference really between K and R strategists is about how they use their resources for reproduction. R strategists produce lots of offspring, and K strategists produce very few offspring. So the R strategists are selecting a quantity strategy, the quantity of offspring, the large number of offspring, whereas K strategists are selecting a quality strategy, the quality of offspring. Another way to look at it is that the offspring with R strategists, they're cheap, they're expendable. Most of them aren't going to make it to adulthood. There's loads of resources around. Resources can be spent on producing offspring, and many of them not making it to maturity. Whereas with your K strategists, there's a lot of competition, not a lot of spare resources. So it's actually, they invest a lot, and they're really valuable. Offspring are really valuable and expensive. So let's do a side-by-side comparison of the R strategists and the K strategists. Firstly, in terms of the number of offspring, R strategists have a large number of offspring. K strategists, small number. In terms of the body size, we generally see that R strategists are smaller and K strategists are larger. The amount of parenting with R strategists is very, very low, might not exist at all. Whereas K strategists invest a large amount of time and effort and resources on parenting. In terms of reproduction, R strategists often only have one cycle of reproduction in their life, whereas K strategists may be capable of having multiple cycles of reproduction. Another thing we often find is with the for sexual reproduction with your R strategists, it's often external fertilization, not always, but often, and external development. So, for example, a turtle may lays a tremendous number of eggs and never ever comes into contact with the offspring, provides no parenting. Whereas, an elephant, for example, internal fertilization and development. In terms of lifespan, R strategists have a short lifespan. K strategists, long lifespan. R strategists is at very, very short time to reach sexual maturity, whereas for K strategists, they have a longer childhood, longer period of time before they reach sexual maturity. The chance of actually maturing, achieving adulthood and achieving sexual maturity for R strategists is actually low, and for K strategists, it's high. R strategists generally live in an unstable environment, whereas K strategists live in a stable environment. In terms of competition, R strategists live in a low competition environment. So this is where they exploit this available niche and reproduce very, very quickly and produce a large population very quickly. Whereas for K strategists, they actually live in a stable environment where there's high competition. This is why there's not a lot of resources available, so it's why the offspring are so expensive. And so in terms of succession, so you see R strategists are your pioneer species, like your weeds and your grasses and things, whereas the K strategists are your climax species, like your big tall trees and your large animals. Now, last thing is that it's a spectrum. So we do have species that are on either side of the spectrum, but of course, most species lie somewhere in between. And it depends on their niche, and it depends on what strategies they use to exploit that niche.